Ja, vi slår på nu. Oke, belum ada pesertanya. Partisipan.
Udah,
Itu baru
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yani udah.
Iya tuh Bu Yani udah tuh.
Ini udah berapa tuh?
Okay.
Um, Sorry, just out of curiosity, you're recording this, is this correct? Yeah.
Yep.
No.
Yeah. Oke. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Selamat pagi, Bapak Ibu. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jess, for joining with us as one of guest lecture for today. So I will introduce Jess. Actually, Jess is assigned to a research center for law for English publication editor, right, Jess? And she will join with us since July 1st until 6 months. So she will be one of if you have some article for publication, so please send the article that is already ready for publication to me, and then I will send to Jess for proofread and final editing. So it is should be like suitable for the what journal that you want to submit. So that will be no like double or triple works. If it's still like in not ready, so please make it like more suitable for publication. So just only like make it like small small editing, not too big like the content and etc. So for this time I asked Jess to deliver a talk. She is actually a lecturer from Victoria University. She teaches master student in international relation and development, and Jessica also an expert of gender and human rights. So she already like experienced working for the UN in Vietnam probably, uh, and she worked on the gender and woman empowerment with this assignment with the UN. So it will be very beneficial for us to listen to her experience working for the UN in this gender empowerment experience. So for today, like I say that she is talking about gender and climate crisis, as we Research Center for Law currently working on DFAT Connexi research program, which is the title is on forced labor and climate change, keeping a focus on women and children. So in this research, we are looking into like the interlink between climate change and its impact on women and children. So with the expertise from Jess, that will be like will help us gain insight what is gender, and then how is like studies of gender and the interlink with how to empower women in this like the impact of climate change. So before we begin our talk, firstly we invite Ibu Emilia as acting head of Research Center for Law to give a welcoming speech for this guest lecture. Please, Ibu Emi.
Okay. Thank you, Ibu Dr. Lali Nurhidayah. Selamat pagi, Bapak Ibu. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, yes, good. Okay. Thank you for coming to the guest lecture series today on Wednesday, 26th of June, 2024, with the topic on gender and climate crisis. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Emilia Justiningrum, and starting on 13th of June, 2024, I'm the acting head of Research Center for Law at the National Research and Innovation Agency, Jakarta, Indonesia. Previously, the position was on the hand of Dr. Laili Nurhidayah. About the topic on the seminar today, we know that climate change affects people in all walks of life, not only for men, but also women and children. Climate change affects women in many aspects, including on social, economic, and cultural aspects. For example, on the economic aspect, Various academic investigations shown that women have limited access to the resources and decision-making process. They increase their vulnerability toward climate-related disaster. In the meantime, there are efforts to mainstream gender on the climate policies, not only on the international level, but also on the national and local level. On the international level, the United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change, UNFCCC, the organized conference of the parties of COP meeting from COP1 in Berlin in Germany in 1995 up to the current COP28 in Dubai, United Arab Emirates in 2023, tried to integrate gender perspective in all levels of policymaking and implementations. In the national level, the Indonesian government tried to integrate the gender perspective on the national regulations, such as on the midterm and long-term national development planning or Rencana Pembangunan Jangka Panjang Menengah Nasional. However, on the national level, climate change is not a single issue. It entangled with other significant issues, such as forestry, environment, agriculture, and even energy. After all, climate change is a complex issue that affects people in all walks of life, and the way to address it involves multiple stakeholders and multiple issues. I wish you all to have a wonderful and fruitful discussion with GenderCC-Women from Victoria University. And now I give the floor to Dr. Laili Nur Hidayah to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu. So now is the time for Jessica to give the presentation. Please, Jess, time is yours.
Thank you so much, Terima kasih, Ibu Laili and Ibu Emilia. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. The first thing you will notice is that I look completely different to the picture that was provided. So my apologies for that. It's a very old promo shot that I have there. I've had a wonderful introduction there, pretty much done most of what I was going to cover. I'm a little bit nervous because I'm just a Australian volunteers program with Bryn and haven't formally started yet, or maybe formally started today, Laili. Can't remember.
The 1st of July, Jess, so next week.
Next week.
So this one is the introduction to all our researcher that you are become a member of our research center.
Great. So what Ibu Laili has invited me to speak on is probably a bit different to what the Australian Volunteers Program has me hired to do, which, as she mentioned, is a lot of the editorial and proofreading of your fantastic publications, of which I have already done one from AJI, which was fantastic. So thank you for sharing that and trusting me with that. But I hope I can just give you an interesting, hopefully brief insight into gender in the climate crisis. I'll work through, I have tried my best to make it not too jargonistic, because unfortunately for me, my Bahasa is terrible. But Ibu Laili has assured me that if anyone is needing clarification or the English Bahasa divide is becoming a problem, she will let me know, but also please feel free to let me know. So I will share my screen and you can just tell me if it is actually working, first of all. Can we all see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Wonderful. So again, I am outside of the Australian Volunteers Program where I'm doing more of an editorial proofreading role with Bryn. I have qualifications, a master's in human rights. I did a graduate diploma in writing and editing. And then my undergraduate and my thesis was in media and cultural studies. I have worked in this field for about 10 years or so. Ibu Laili mentioned at the UN, that's been on and off in various different Southeast Asian and South Asian countries for the last few years. But most recently, I have been lecturing at an Australian university in Melbourne called Victoria University. And if you would like to talk to me about that university, I'm always happy to. I know that Bryn has a strong connection to Griffith University, which is a fantastic university here as well. Just pause quickly so that I don't have to check the chat too much. Ibu Laili, or is there someone to support me just to let me know if there's something in the chat that I need to address? At the moment, it's just Aji saying hello, hello.
Yeah.
Great. So if you wouldn't mind just checking and letting me know, feel free to interrupt me so I know to address that. So my disclaimer is I always want to acknowledge my privilege. So whilst I'm not by any means an Indonesia expert, all of you are, at any point I would love to learn from you, collaborate and increase impact by sharing some international experience and connecting some of the multinational laws to locally led adaptable and sustainable settings. So this will be quite practical, I think. There actually may be a missing slide in there somewhere where I have a list of all of my academic theorists that I wanted to share with you. But I have a feeling it's gotten lost or it's empty in this presentation. So please forgive that. That's a bit embarrassing for me. But yeah, so in the field, I have worked with the UN, the Red Cross, various universities, governments, research institutions, just like this one, and NGOs, which is non-government organizations, so charities. And as an Australian who is not an Indigenous landowner, it is my practice to commence every presentation, gathering or group meeting with something called an acknowledgement of country. And by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land which we meet today, so for you different, but for me, that is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri clans of the Kulin Nations. And I would like to pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that might be here today by chance. You never know. And those from other traditional and Indigenous cultures, I pay my respects as well. So where I am, it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty of this country we know as Australia was never ceded. And especially when it comes to gender, the reason I always want to draw a connection to our Indigenous peoples is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia are actually the oldest surviving ancient culture in the world, despite the ravages of colonization having really deeply affected their population. And of particular relevance to what I'm discussing with you today is that their environmental practices involve deep connections to land. They're a land people. Everything is sacred when it comes to land and environment. And it's all actually deeply tied to a matriarchal valued society. So in a lot of Indigenous cultures, I have found that women are, the sort of protectors of of the planet, of the Earth. So I just thought that was interesting to note, and a bit of quick cultural lesson of Australia. And in a specific instance, this has actually made the news, the international news, quite a lot. I have a particular interest in Indigenous women. So as Ibu Layli mentioned, I'm a gender expert. My particular expertise is actually in gender-based violence protection and prevention. I haven't done gender and climate change work for a long time, since I was at the UN working on the Montreal Protocol, but I've done my best to link it all for something that Layli and I thought might be foreign to a few people. I mean, it's not the most talked about subject, gender and climate crises. I will be using climate crises and change. It means the same thing, but I sometimes forget the reason I want to use the word crises is because it's not change now. It's much more dramatic, right? It's a crisis. We're in crisis. So again, just of interest, this connection between women and climate change and environment. The Indigenous peoples of the land where I live have a certain group of trees called the Jaborang trees. And the biggest one of which is their sacred birthing tree. And their belief is that these ancient trees actually carry their bloodlines, and that as these trees live, they act as guardians for their children and their children's children, and their ancestors are active there. So when we talk about sacredness within life, begins and ends with nature, begins and ends with environment. I know this doesn't sound very academic, but bear with me. We're talking about ancient environments, especially when we're talking about climate crisis. We need to go back and sort of think about those, you know, ancient and traditional practices before humanity came in and really kind of messed things up. So there always has been this deep connection in particular ancient and indigenous cultures. So for this particular clan, it's where they go to give birth. It's where they call women's business is conducted, and so that's anything that's specific to their gender. So was that a question, or was that someone's mic just turned on? No, okay. So it's just important to keep in mind as we, you know, go through this, and as I keep convincing people of the importance of gender and climate crisis, that, you know, Indigenous peoples, with my declaration at the beginning of, you know, this is very, so it's gone ahead. This is, I present as white, you know, I am relatively privileged. I live in a country free from war. I am educated. So I always try to keep in mind the intersectional disadvantage of the people I'm working with or trying to support. And for me, that always means incorporating gender, obviously. Gender's the first thing on my mind, but indigeneity and diversity of all kinds, cultural, physical. So I've got just a quick video. It's actually from, I think, UN Women in Indonesia. Why do we talk about gender and climate crisis? Why do we do it? Why do we care? So let's set the scene, and tell me if there's any issues with audio or anything.
Planting Project merupakan implementasi wahana visi Indonesia menggunakan dana dari World Vision Korea dengan tujuan proyek ini untuk mengkaji efektivitas adaptasi perubahan iklim dalam mengurangi resiko kerentanan sehingga dapat mengurangi kecenderungan terjadinya kekerasan dalam rumah tangga di masyarakat, terutama terhadap anak dan perempuan. Proyek ini dapat mendukung masyarakat yang rentan untuk beradaptasi dengan dampak negatif perubahan iklim, sekaligus mendukung anak-anak dan perempuan untuk meningkatkan ketahanan mereka dengan meningkatkan perlindungan dan mata pencaharian melalui energi terbarukan. Melalui Project Lenting selama 10 bulan pelaksanaan, dimulai dari bulan Desember 2020 hingga bulan September 2021, Wahana Visi Indonesia telah melaksanakan beberapa kegiatan di antaranya. Pengembangan teknik irigasi tetes yang tersebar di 6 titik lokasi demplot dengan luas area sebesar 10 area. Tujuannya untuk memulai bisnis mereka dan mengoptimalkan hasil produksi mereka secara terus-menerus, sehingga menghasilkan mata pencaharian yang lebih baik bagi keluarga dan anak-anak mereka, serta mengurangi beban perempuan petani di daerah kering untuk menyiram tanamannya setiap hari, sehingga dapat menghemat waktu dan tenaga untuk tugas-tugas lain dan istirahat. Selain itu, mengurangi beban fisik mengangkat air juga berdampak pada peningkatan kesehatan perempuan. Sebanyak 120 perempuan tergabung dalam 6 kelompok wanita. Tidak hanya melakukan pengembangan dan pemeliharaan, teknik irigasi tetes juga melakukan pendampingan skema pengelolaan pendapatan keuangan dari hasil panen hingga terbentuknya koperasi yang telah dikukuhkan oleh Dinas Koperasi.
Terima kasih banyak kami ucapkan kepada Wahana Visi yang telah membantu kami dari pematangan kita, lalu penanaman dengan cara irigasi tetes.
Harapan kami dari kelompok wanita tani itu supaya hasil pertanian lebih maju dan dengan menggunakan organik sehingga bisa membuat pertanian yang sehat, bagus, dan yang berkualitas.
12 unit penerangan jalan umum terbangun di 3 desa Kecamatan Sembalun yang tujuannya menyediakan penerangan yang memadai di lingkungan sekitar desa dengan harapan dapat berkontribusi dalam pencegahan tindak pidana, termasuk kekerasan terhadap perempuan, remaja, dan anak.
Setelah adanya program dari Wahana Visi untuk perlindungan anak ini, ada perubahan untuk terutama memenuhi hak-hak anak, terutama di kami keluarga maupun di masyarakat.
Mendukung pemerintah dan sistem kepedulian masyarakat untuk melindungi anak, keluarga, dan kelompok rentan dengan mengajak 15 orang untuk tergabung dalam kelompok kerja perlindungan perempuan dan anak atau Pokja PPA sebagai fasilitator desa yang menerima pelatihan dan pendampingan terkait dengan anak, sistem rujukan pelaporan kasus, serta mitigasi dan adaptasi perubahan iklim yang telah diterima oleh 450 anak.
Wahana Visi mengajarkan kita untuk bagaimana mengajarkan anak-anak untuk mengetahui haknya, untuk melindungi dirinya, dan kemana akan melapor anak-anak jika haknya terganggu atau terhalang. Terima kasih untuk Wahana Visi. Semoga kedepannya Wahana Visi bisa maju, bangkit, dan sejahtera. Terima kasih Wahana Visi.
So hopefully that gave a small introduction into a few of the key concepts. Luckily, I found an organization that was working in Indonesia. The key concepts, again, as my two esteemed colleagues had picked up on, is that the disproportionate impact on women and children is something that is of great concern when we talk about climate crisis, and it's exacerbated in climate crisis. And what we're trying to do, I guess, is to adapt to increase the protection for women and children, but also to increase resilience, to upskill, to empower, although I hate that word, empower. Everyone loves that word. It's kind of lost its meaning these days. And I think I was supposed to pick one of 2 of these videos. Maybe I won't bore you with this one. Let me see. That organization, we're actually going to, it's the same video. We're actually going to go back and revisit that. organization a bit later. I'm going to be reading probably directly off slides for a bit, if that's okay, just to keep myself speaking at a pace that is understandable and also might be easier to read rather than listen. Not necessarily for language barriers, that's just how I operate in terms of cultural and diversity and equity inclusion. Some of my students, prefer to read, some of them prefer to listen to my voice. So we're talking about it because the climate crisis is not gender neutral. We're talking about it because women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change. And anyone at any point can feel free to, argue with me on that point, but be prepared for me to back it up with all sorts of statistics. And what this does is it just amplifies existing gender inequalities. Worse, it poses unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and safety. Across the women, and this is general, women tend to have less access to natural resources. In many regions, women bear a disproportionate responsibility for securing food, water, fuel, the basics that you need to survive. Agriculture is the most important employment sector for women in low and lower middle income countries. So during periods of drought, erratic rainfall, things that occur as a result of the climate crisis, women as these primary procurers and workers are really put under that extra level of pressure to keep their families safe, keep the income secure. And as you know, anything that affects the mother affects the child as well, and the father and the family unit. But, the protection and the food provision, if that falls to the mothers, which it does a lot of the time in the lower socioeconomic countries, then the children feel that burden as well. So this is from a publication that I did a while ago. And what we know already about climate change is the frequency and severity of the hazards are just becoming, I would say, terrifying. And I live again in a privileged country, Australia, where we are arguably supposed to have the resources to deal with it. But, I've worked in a lot of Pacific countries and they're hit by, tsunamis every other week. It's devastating. And Australia, for the first time, experienced in 2019 double disaster with the worst bushfires, I think, on record in history, synonymous at the same time with COVID-19. So no one is exempt, I guess is the point. And I care to talk about climate crises to anyone who will listen, purely because it terrifies me. But as a woman and as a gender specialist, I also have a responsibility to educate about these disproportionate effects, because they're not immediate. It affects all of us, but it does affect women and children far more. So a few of the stats, so these are 2023 stats, so they're pretty up to date. Number of people exposed to flood-prone areas has risen almost a quarter in the last 20 years. So this is what I mean when I say it's quite terrifying. Extreme rainfall, rising sea levels, intense hurricanes, all of this. And like I said, the Pacific or the low-lying islands, Kiribati, Maldives, Marshall Islands, they face full-on existential threats due to sea level rise and climate crisis. So again, back to that word terrifying, we're looking at, the next 20 years of potential wiping out of people. So specifically, so that's just flood. And you'll also notice I rarely use the word natural disasters, because these are, let's be realistic, human made disasters. You know, we have affected or at least sped up and worsened climate change. But we are also doing incredible things to mitigate and adapt, which I will get to. But one of the biggest statistics I want to draw attention to is that today, 53 of 191 countries and areas globally, so that's 1.5 billion women and girls, 37.2% of the world's population, are facing high or very high exposure to drought. So 37.2% of the population, women and girls, that's a huge proportion to be affected by drought, which is a part of climate crisis. And in a high emissions scenario, our projections suggested further exposure could affect additional 9 to 17% of the world's population by 2030, 50 to 90% by 2080. Things are getting pretty dire. So we have I would say we don't have enough climate action plans with specific references to gender equality. And when this refers, so 55 national climate action plans make a specific reference to gender equality. We would like, in an ideal world, every country to have a national plan for climate resilience, but we would like them to be like the 23 countries that do recognize women as agents of change in that. And as we know, at COP27, at the last COP, 27 women made up only 35% of the party delegates. So still an underrepresentation of women, even at these higher discussion levels. So one of the results, again, of climate crises, poverty and hunger, it's statistically, as we know, expected to rise as a result. Again, it disproportionately affecting women and children. The magnitude of its effects is actually unknown in terms of how bad it could get. But the projections that we saw on the slide before, and what we know of the reality of women and children in countries that are most affected, is again painting quite a dire picture. So this two scenarios hopefully doesn't depress you too much, but again hammers home the idea that we need to get gender on the agenda. There's two possible climate futures here. The current path we're on, where the average temperature rises by 2 degrees but stabilizes. And then there's the worst case scenario, where the average temperature rises get worse. So worst case, by 2050, close to 160 million women and girls globally may be pushed into poverty. And that is as a direct result of climate change, notwithstanding the things that the previous video touched on, gender-based violence, which I'll try not to get too deep into, but it is a huge factor. Just poverty as a result of climate change. And food insecurity, that's close to 240 million more women and girls. And the comparative figure there is the interesting one. So 240 million more women and girls are going to be affected by this compared to 131 million men and boys. So we've got to get women and girls in the conversation. Investments in comprehensive SDG stimulus packages would help mitigate this effect. That is just UN jargon for us to say, please join up to the treaties and meet your sustainable development goals. But, you know, that is the best case scenario if we do reduce those numbers. And if we can potentially do it, if we could go back in time and start doing it 20, 30 years ago, that would be great. But the time is now because it's going to get exponentially worse. And I assume that Ibulaili will send you these slides, so feel free to have a look at the stats that they've collated in the last, I think, year from IPCC. But again, they're pretty harrowing for the worst case scenario. And this diagram specifically shows you the women, the effect on women. So when we look at worst case, I'm saying worst case and best case. So worst case would be red, best case would be blue. It's not really best case, is it? But it's if we do put in the work, if we do gender mainstream, if we do implement these strategic national plans with gender involved, as we saw in the previous slide, there's only 23 countries that have, we're looking at a lot less damage. And that's pretty much the, gist of what this graph is trying to show us. Again, it's a little bit of a PR exercise for the United Nations, pushing people to include the SDG goals on their agenda, but the research is there, and it is compelling. And I don't actually know how to go back now to the previous screen, but again, if you wanted to investigate that data yourself, you can feel free. But in summary, the worst case scenario is millions and millions and millions. Women and children, we're not even taking into account men yet. And the drastic difference that could be made if we were to make the necessary changes. And we are, but not doing it fast enough. But there is a sustainable future to be made. And this arcs back to my harping on about Indigenous women. I think it's such an overlooked aspect of gender and sustainability, environment, cultural preservation. Can someone tell me, I think Indonesia has one of the most diverse Indigenous populations, or is it Myanmar?
I'm not sure, Jess, but I think we have like 500. I'm not sure.
So that's incredible, 500 different Indigenous populations. We have one, but they're divided into 300, what they call clans. So it's sub groups. But so I harp on about this Indigenous cultural approach to ecology, sustainability, and adapting to climate change, because Indigenous women in particular are often holders of the knowledge. And like I said, in an Australian case study, they have such strong ties to nature, and they have such strong ties to earth and the resources. Again, sometimes this sounds all a little bit, I don't know if you'll all resonate with this word, but it sounds all a bit hippie, save the planet, yay, women, Mother Earth. But it's more about an understanding of cultures that have existed long before these problems existed. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have some of the most sophisticated agricultural and aqueduct practices that I've ever seen. And there's been studies that if we go back to that, we'll be using more sustainable, we'll be using our lands more sustainably. But gender inequality is the pervasive thing. So even though women, and in particular Indigenous women, have, I would say, such strength to adapt to the risk and mitigate the difficulties that the climate crisis presents, they're often sidelined because we still have gender inequality in all areas. And despite that, though, what you will find is women have persistently been at the forefront of water and land protection and preservation efforts. They've been at the forefront of activism. You'll see in flood settings, I've seen in the Pacific, there's the men tend to be in the governments, which is fine and great, you know, dealing with the how do we get the financial support and the logistical support. But, you know, I always seem to see the women there kind of gathering up the families and supplies and, you know, doing what they can to protect homes and things like that. So, you know, we're all on the front lines, but women seem to be on the front lines and then not necessarily as supported or integrated or given the capacity to really do what they have the potential to do. And ensuring the rights of those women goes hand in hand with addressing the climate crisis. Because we can't just do it with the men, right? And we can't just do it with the women. We've got to all do it together. But if we have gender inequality, we need to address these gender inequalities so that the women can be contributing in the same way. So this is where we get into, I think I may have made this more practical than academic. Apologize for that. But again, I wasn't quite sure of my audience in terms of, I feel like everyone in this room is much smarter than me. So it's a very general introduction into the ideas of gender and climate crisis. So please don't hold it against me if all of this is common knowledge for you. But what we need in gender and climate crisis is women in leadership roles, decision-making tables, discussing those solutions, coming up with those solutions. And the data and research on climate and climate solutions needs to include gender. Ibu Laili and I were talking about this offline, how data collection doesn't have yet sophisticated enough measures in a gender perspective to give us an accurate idea of what that whole picture looks like. We can see the discrepancies very clearly, but we need to see a bit more of the nuance. So that as well, some of that nuance is, again, we discussed this offline, the issues that arise from forced migration and the spikes in gender-based violence that happen in times of climate crisis. Basically, this whole, you know, UN explainer document we produced was to convince people that investments in gender-responsive climate mitigation and adaptation are vital. We can't do it without all of us. So again, to summarize that disproportionality, again, I've worked quite a lot in areas of Asia, and I found that women have unique challenges in terms of social roles, economic positions, and limited accesses to resources. We have all of that in Australia. You don't even want to know how bad our gender inequality stats are here. It's embarrassing for a, you know, Western democratic nation that's got all the money in the world. I'm very cynical, I apologize. Oh, and I shouldn't be, because the Australian government is giving me the opportunity to volunteer with you. But in Asia, you know, there's all the unique issues that are not the same for me here or for women here. Vandana Shiva is a really interesting environmental activist and feminist theorist. I use her a lot in my gender studies courses. Again, her whole argument is that women have this close relationship with nature, and the fact that traditionally them as managers of the household make them particularly vulnerable. Does that make sense? Because I'm not sure if I'm being as clear on that. Thumbs up emoji. Audio, anything? Is anyone even still there? Is anyone out there? Is anyone alive? Did Indonesia just experience a climate crisis? Have you all been wiped out? I'll just keep going.
Yeah, you just keep doing this.
Okay. And it's all going okay, Layli?
Yes, we are
Making-
following you. I mean, we
All following, able to follow?
yeah, enjoying. I mean, Yeah,
Great, okay.
you still have time. Maybe 5 minutes.
So 5 minutes? Did you say we only have 5 minutes?
No, for your presentation, and then followed by Q&A.
Oh, okay. We had 2 hours, 10 till 12. Anyway, I'm keeping on going. I've got a lot more to cover, so I'll try and go quicker. So, summary of the 3 major areas where women and children are more vulnerable: agriculture, food security, health and safety, economic inequality. I wonder if I'll try and skim through these. Agriculture and food security. Actually, I won't skim through these points because we've covered them. So the agriculture and food security is to do with women tending to be, and these are really mass generalizations, but again, they're supported by research from people like you and a lot of UN data reporting. They're at risk being, you know, the people who are caring for the household and the majority of agricultural workers. Health and safety, the biggest one there I want to draw attention to is that gender-based violence spikes in climate crises. And economic inequalities are quite stark in management of climate crisis because probably it just coming back down to power. So women who don't have the means, access, leadership, prowess, are going to be less likely to be at the forefront of those climate crisis talks. So again, like I said, very briefly, one of the worst issues for women and one of the biggest ones we want to address in gender and climate change is gender-based violence. And there's a few key areas where that comes out, and it comes out directly from climate crisis. So climate crisis causes displacement and migration. Displaced women and girls are particularly vulnerable to things like sexual violence, trafficking, financial insecurity results when climate crises happen. Then that impacts livelihoods, and that impacts, as we've discussed, women's ability to procure agriculture, to take care of households. Health disruptions. Women's health is still a very underexplored, undervalued aspect globally. We still have to simplify things in terms of medical trials, for example. If you look at most medical trials in, you know, the United States, the Mayo Clinic, whatever fancy medical clinic you can think of, it's only recently that there's been specifically female or gender diverse based trials. You know, when drugs were trialed and things like that in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the selected period people to be tested on were always men. So we didn't know that much about, you know, women's health. So health disruptions from climate crises are going to be potentially more dramatic for women. Compounded conflict, crisis and conflict zones, obviously we have higher risks of violence there. And disaster response and recovery, again, we've briefly sort of talked about how the burden falls a lot on women there, and they're on the front lines a lot, but potentially without the support or the information and capacity building that they need to do that. I won't go through this then if we're trying to speed things along, but it's another case study from Australia just to indicate how and why those domestic violence, gender-based violence incidences are related to climate crises and why they tend to peak in climate crises. So what do we do, I guess? What do we need to address? The list is here, and I won't go through them, but one of the first 2 or 3 slides said climate crisis isn't gendered or something. God, I can't even remember my own quote. Different impacts for men and women in climate crisis. And that is due to what I call intersectional factors, which again, I know you're all familiar with: social, economic, cultural, women just tend to be disadvantaged in most of those areas, in the lower socioeconomic income countries, even more so. We're experiencing exacerbated vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities I just listed, all exacerbated with climate hazards. The economic implications are interesting because we actually lose a lot of gender equality in the workforce after climate crisis. Women tend to have other responsibilities to take care of if they are in the workforce and they drop out. Or, you know, again, in these particularly agricultural run societies where the women run these small farming enterprises, if they're destroyed, then the workforce, that part of the workforce is essentially destroyed as well. How do we address gender and climate crises? We have to do it with a rights-based approach. We have to assume that not everyone is affected equally. We have to enhance our policies. Again, we have 23 countries that have climate crisis adaptation strategies, plans, whatever you want to call them. Only 23 that have gender, what's the word I'm looking for? Gender components. We have to build inclusive solutions. Again, we need to just acknowledge that women have a different set of skills to bring to the table. Like I explained with Indigenous women, perhaps, you know, there's a connection there to land, culture, and country that perhaps we might be underestimating or excluding. And the global commitments, as you know, the Paris Agreement, SDGs, things like that, all of those these days, with few exceptions, have gender, what we call gender mainstreaming embedded into them, which is great. So we need to follow those global commitments and really honor them. This might be where one of my slides has disappeared. So stepping back, you know, into the academic world. So we've got all these theories and frameworks around this kind of work, but they're very broad, cross-cutting areas. And as some of you may know, it's a, I would say, very new area of academic scholarship. And that's only because I consider, you know, real discussions on gender and climate change to have begun with people like, do I have her on the next slide? Let's see. No. Sorry. Basically, I just believe that it's a new area of academic and scholarship, relatively new. And the three main schools of thought we have at the moment, with more and more theorists coming out, and what is great is more and more male academics talking about this stuff, which is called male allyship in the gender terminology world, which is wonderful. Intersectionality is kind of the top of the game. So we always want to do an intersectional approach with climate crisis in general, because all sorts of people have more vulnerabilities that arise from non-climatic factors. And they're often produced, or they often come from, you know, social, economic, cultural, political, institutional, anything that can marginalize someone makes them more vulnerable. And an intersectional approach to gender and, sorry about that, gender and climate crises means that, sorry, I just got completely distracted by my alarm. Sorry, back to intersectionality. The product of intersectionality is that if we don't address it, all of those inequalities just become exponentially bigger. So if we want to address the gender inequalities or the disproportionate effect on women in climate crises, intersectionality is one of the core frameworks to be used because it includes the disadvantages that women and children can experience compared to men, I guess, or, you know, people in positions of more power, more influence. There's a new emergent area of scholarship called ecofeminism. Won't go too much into that, but it's a more activist themed. Vandana Shiva, Carolyn Merchant, they're about subjugation of women. So they are, yeah, very activist, very, you know, righteous. But, you know, there's always space for that in scholarship. And then as always, there's feminist political ecology. So that's looking at the gender, power, and politics intersect in environmental contexts. And as I keep saying, those become so dramatic when we plonk them into climate crises contexts. What do we do about it? Research, innovation, policy making, that's what as far as I know, this organization specializes in and is very excellent at. And this is what I believe academia and research play a crucial role in shaping the policies and innovations that we need to address the climate crisis. So it's research and policy development, it's innovation and technology. Asian Institute of Technology has done some really interesting work in Thailand for early warning systems and climate smart agricultural practices that are tailored to women. And the obvious, again, if anyone's worked in, you know, human rights, humanitarian context, disaster risk reduction and mitigation, capacity building and education. So academic institutions play a crucial role in that. And also we want to be incorporating an inclusive leadership and decision-making approach to mitigation of climate crisis, which is gender inclusive and gender responsive. So one of the biggest trends, both internationally and locally, is this concept called gender mainstreaming. And I just need to check. Yeah. So the idea of gender mainstreaming is basically that we want to embody all processes, strategies, and tools that can ensure that women can access, participate, and benefit from development projects like climate resilience. We want them to be on equal footing, and we want to close the inequalities that stop that from being the case. So basically, in climate crisis strategies, solutions, what we want to do is gender mainstream. So really put at the center, or at least running through, this idea that gender issues do need to be considered throughout project cycles, implementation, design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. Keep that gender idea running through all of these interventions, research, policies that we're trying to get going. And what that looks like is, let me just see if we won't, again, for time's sake, go through this, but the Montreal Protocol, can we all see my Montreal Protocol view? Hope so. Assume so. Not hearing any no's. So
Yes,
the Montreal,
please.
thank you. The Montreal Protocol, if you don't know, was adapted in 1987, and it was to phase out substances called chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons. Basically, it was designed to close the hole in the ozone layer. And to this day, it remains the most successful international environmental treaty ever. I believe that's because right from the get-go, we have gender mainstreamed every Montreal Protocol project. That is what I believe. And if I go back to my slides, what a gender mainstreaming protocol or an idea of one looks like is whenever you're thinking about these issues, whenever you're thinking about the climate crisis and an approach to, you know, a program that addresses the climate crisis, or any real strategy, I would say, at a government level or a research project that involves intersectionality, there's a sort of a checklist here that the Montreal Protocol used. It doesn't have to look like that, obviously, but the things that you want to keep in the back of your mind, but try to push to the forefront are gender inequalities within the scope of the project. So obviously you're not looking at every gender inequality in the world. And I would say the most important is you want to ensure that the needs and vulnerabilities of both men and women are addressed, because men and women are distinct in that way. So their capacities, skills, they can be very distinct, and you want to make sure that they're both considered and utilized. You want to ensure that both men and women have equal access to input, equal leadership, equal voice, equal benefit. And again, we've got this issue of data, which is something I'd really like to explore more, but haven't had a chance to yet. The sex disaggregated data and qualitative information that we can get. There's a lot of good mechanisms out there, but not quite good enough. Are things we really need to start using if we want to find ways where we can address the climate crisis from a gendered perspective, because that is one of the places we're failing. We're failing to address the climate crisis from a gender perspective, and I believe that's why it's getting worse and worse. So let's skip to, we won't go through all of these. I'm not sure, Layli, what are we doing for time? So you told me 2 hours.
Yeah, if it's now, if you finish, we can start question and answer. But if you can finish your presentation, please.
Okay, no worries. Okay, I won't go through the examples. You can ask me about them if you're interested, but they're just a few that I've liked internationally that have been quite successful. And one in Australia, an Indigenous women's one. Again, I'm just wanting to sort of show you this kind of stuff. This is the kind of work I do in the implementation side of things, that I suppose this is more for BRIN people working directly with government agencies maybe, or NGOs that are putting proposals to agencies for programs. So this is a ongoing program, a successful program, and they wanted to put Aboriginal women at the center of climate adaptation and resilience, and as a sort of an extra added benefit, revitalize that Aboriginal culture. As I mentioned, in Australia, which you might not know, it's been under threat for 200 years since colonization. So implementation, the important stuff was women's leadership. All of that other stuff on the slide too, but women's leadership. And the outcomes and impact it required addressing things in an aggregated, disaggregated gender qualitative and quantitative analysis. So we don't know that yet. They haven't released a report, but you want to see, as a result of a gender mainstreaming climate crisis project, that women are getting empowerment and recognition, that they're feeling like they have increased resilience, and that they've established sustainable practices. And the last thing I want to make clear about gender and climate crises is there is nothing to be done without co-design. There's a tendency, I've worked for Australian Red Cross before, and they used to have what we call, sorry? The Australian Red Cross had what we used to call the white savior complex, where they would come into a country and fix the problem and then leave. But as I said at the start of this presentation, I'm not Indonesian. I don't know, the issues of Indonesia like the back of my hand. I'm no expert. So I and everyone needs to be involved in a concept called co-design, where probably even more than co-design, I would say fully locally led and then supported by the rich people, by funders, by governments, etc. So in this particular case study, they centralized the Aboriginal groups and organizations. So they were the primary implementing agencies, a women's centre, an Aboriginal women's centre, and then working with and behind and in support were the funding sources, which was a NGO and the Australian government. These I won't go through because you probably already know them, but we have a few examples of so far so good gender responsive climate action plans. The Bangladesh one was one of the first adopted, and they have, with the help of other agencies, included very strong gender mainstreaming. There's a very interesting program in Sri Lanka, the Jalahavini. So it's been a long-term training program to upskill women in eco-friendly agriculture, water conservation, all these things that will mitigate their risk to climate crises. And a thing that I don't understand at all called green finance. All I know is that it's moving public, private, and not for profit dollars over to sustainable priorities. That's all I know. And that's why I've put in the UNEP's visual documentation of that. Green finance, not my area of expertise, but it's a very popular programmatic response in Asia at the moment. So here we are in Indonesia. This is from my UNEP colleagues in Indonesia who have passed this on. So we've got, and tell me if I'm wrong, as I said, I am not the expert of this country, it is yours. But as we've indexed it, we've got Indonesia as the 14th most affected by extreme weather events. We've got temperatures expected to rise significantly, scarily. We have vulnerability to sea levels rising. You have had, you know, devastatingly high numbers of disaster events, which is just awful. And in Indonesia, they do find that women play an essential role in the supply and use of energy in daily life, but, agree or disagree, largely excluded from the policy-making processes in that sector. So again, that's where gender mainstreaming can come in. Policies and strategies, I don't know. So in question time, you can talk to me about it. I know the only one that I know is the one that I'm familiar with. DFAT is my government, Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and that's COMPAC. I don't even know if there's an updated one of that. You can tell me. One of the interesting things that's going on in Indonesia at the moment is the partnership with UN Women and UN Environment Program. It's called Empower Women for Climate Resilient Societies. It's in phase 2, but that doesn't really mean anything because phase 1 was just for other countries. So Indonesia has become a part of phase 2. It's only just started effectively. And what the aim is are all of these things on the right here. So the goals are to have increased capacity of women and marginalized individuals to exercise leadership in decision-making processes. 3 policies and actions that are gender responsive and human rights based will be implemented and monitored. That's interesting to me because on the previous slide, I said I don't know the Indonesia policies and strategies for climate crisis mitigation and adaptation and whether they have gender interventions involved. And the UN and UN environment doesn't seem to think that there are that many because they're only aiming to achieve 3. They are aiming to achieve gender equality commitments increase in intergovernmental decisions, and I know that Britain plays a huge part in influencing that. They would like to see a huge investment in gender responsive renewable energy entrepreneurship. They believe that 12,000 women will benefit from climate resilient livelihoods and services. Again, that's just a bit of a UN projection statistic that comes from nowhere. But again, what's very interesting, and another trend, is MSMEs. So MSMEs are micro, small, and medium enterprises. Again, sorry if you know that. But they're hoping to assist to build 250 of those, specifically with climate in mind and renewable energy. And the Australian Partner Program, one of the ones from the Australian Volunteer Program that I'm with, has been PPMK. So it was female farmers struggling in Yogyakarta, struggling to deal with the effects of climate crisis. And obviously that's leading to more dramatic things like poverty. So this is a program, again, I think still in operation. What it would have been was started a few years ago and then upscaled, you know, so it might be in phase 2 or 3 now. But they had a number of programs to educate and upskill women to manage the climate crisis effects. And the first phase in 2022 had 30 women take part in a program that was run by Australian volunteers. Workshops, in-person home visits. These women learnt about organic farming, importance of planting trees, soil health, waste management, the impacts of climate change. What I found most interesting, though, was the women learned how to sort between organic and non-organic waste and how to compost it to use it for their own garden, right? So the sustainability. But also they can sell the non-organic waste to a recycling company, and that opens up new business opportunities for them. And that's what we really want to look at in climate crises. We want to keep looking at sustainable options, sustainable for women. Why? Because women are more affected by these crises. So the better supported they can be, the less dramatic the outcomes are. There we go, I did it. Finished. Thank you so much. I hope it has been at least, you know, a very brief introduction into some of the gender and climate crises issues that are at the forefront of my mind, at least, and maybe at the front of some of yours. And I'll hand back to Ibu Laili.
Thank you so much, Jess. It is very interesting lecture from you. I know you are you love teaching so much. So this is to show you how you love teaching. So I think there's some of a question from the audience. So I will invite Pak Junaidi and then Ibu, probably there's one question from the chat. So probably can you ask directly to Jessica? Maybe
I've got one from Lisa.
please, yeah. Probably can Pak Junaidi or Bu Liz to speak the question, please.
Okay, who will be the first? Is that me?
Yeah, Pak Junaidi.
Okay. Is my voice clear? Is my voice clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor for me to be here, and it's really insightful presentation. Actually, thank you very much. And in this gala occasion, I actually would like to ask a couple of questions for the speaker regarding the topic today, Firstly, we know that in this digital era, there are so many social movement to support and to concern about environmental issues on gender equality or feminist perspective is that where we could see by there are so many social movement like NGO, social organization, alternative media, or something of that. And with that condition, we find it difficult to make a huge impact to contribute more in undertaking environmental issues by feminist perspective or gender equality perspective is itself, because of the increasing number of the social movement, the government would prioritize and make full of selection to collaborate together. So my question is, digital era government or some kind of.
It cut out exactly after you said my question is. Sorry.
What is your question? Can you repeat again, Pak?
Sorry. Okay, maybe it's my connection. My question is, in this digital era, how can we collaborate together with the institutional governments to contribute more, and how can we deal with the condition right now where there are so many social movement? And the second one, I'd like to know.
I might answer your first one. Can I answer your first one?
Okay.
So I think you've made a really interesting point, if I have this correct, about the disparate nature of all of the sort of small, I guess, scale organizations trying to work on these issues. I think, and what I hope, and the model in Australia, whether for better or worse, and I'm talking about Australia as both a local and an international funder, is that if there are disparate NGOs, but all sort of working on the same goal, they will try to disseminate funding to all of them, or they will do what I think is probably the same in Indonesian government, is do a tender program. So put it to tender and say, you know, if you can convince us why we should give you money to support this, then we'll do it. And the actual onus is on the government to make sure that all the areas are covered. So there'll be, as you said, there's so many NGOs and lots of them will be doing the same thing. So if they're not going to come together organically themselves, then it needs to start at the top with the government, who have a clear strategy of the clear pillars that they want to address, and then how much money they want to invest in each of those. And then that can be disseminated to the appropriate areas of NGOs. And, you know, if an NGO needs funding, for example, but they can't sort of justify their cause, then it's going to be incredibly difficult. But I think what appears to be working in my experience is when ideally the NGOs come together, but they don't tend to want to merge a lot of the time. Ideally what happens is they will approach people for funding, and the people giving the money, it is on them to ensure that the program is going to be successful, because they're the people that are supposedly with the knowledge and resources and money, you know, they're the ones with the power, the people in the government. So what would happen at the UN was we would have a lot of those organizations approach us with a brief, and then they would get sent to the big donor countries. And that's what this program Empower is. It's the Swiss government, government of Switzerland and the New Zealand government. So they're the two big donors, because the project was pitched to the United Nations, and they decided they really wanted to invest in that. Does that answer the first question?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
And the second question?
But actually, the second question you have answered the second question, because actually my second question is related to the founding itself. It's really captivating when you say that in your own country, like the social movement or NGO or some kind of that, it will support by the government or social or governmental institution itself. But in my country, it's really hard actually. Maybe on the paper, we will be supported by the government, but in the reality, it's really hard actually, as I said before, because there are so many social movements, so the government would prioritize and make full selection of it. So yeah, it's really hard. But you have answered my question.
It's a human rights and humanitarianism fight is a surprisingly cutthroat, competitive environment, because everyone needs money. And I wish it didn't, but in this society, in this capitalist world we live in, it does fall to governments and rich people. You know, there are big funders out there. Elon Musk could put some of his money to a good gender initiative. But unfortunately or fortunately, yeah, that is the way until we can find a different way forward. And you're right. If you don't align with the government priorities, then you can't be supported. But I forget, correct me if I'm wrong, that is the role of, I would say, research and innovation organizations to be guiding governments in those priority areas, correct? And I would hope that, you know, if you need funding for gender responsive climate adaptation in 6 different NGOs, that should be easy to implement, because eventually Indonesia will have a gender responsive climate adaptation strategy, and they'll have these 3 commitments to that, address funding for those. Yeah. That's ideal as well, you know. I know it's not that easy, and I know it's much harder.
It's really complicated.
Yeah, much harder in a government like Indonesia as well. You know, my government is I call it a soft government. They just, you know, they do go where the people go, and they go where the research institutes tell them to go, because we have such a, you know, large privilege of freedom of speech. And, you know, if you take away any of our rights, then everyone comes out in droves until the policies are changed, kind of thing, you know. So like I said, I'm not familiar with country contexts where things are probably a lot harder.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Probably the second question is Mbak Dina, and then one question from the chat is from Lisa. She said women, health, and climate change. Would you say that pregnant women are more impacted, and what can be done about this? So it is she asked about pregnant woman and climate
So
change.
this for Lisa?
Yeah, Lisa. And Dina, could you please ask your question?
Thank you very much, Ibu Lely, and very nice to listen to your presentation, Miss Jess. Before I ask you, I want to tell you that I have maybe my English is not very good, and maybe it's about the language barrier.
My
So
bahasa sedikit.
Okay. Yes. Miss Jess, I joined your presentation. I was late, so it in the middle of your presentation, and then here we come into the question part. I'm non-expert in climate change, and I want to know from you why you said in your last slide that climate change affected women the most, because from the last slide, like I said, I was late to attend your presentation because I have another meeting, but I am glad that I joined because I have new I have new knowledge from you. You said that in your last presentation that women affected the most from the climate change. What I want to ask is, what is the difference between the climate change affected to the men and the women? Because if it is about the poverty and hunger, of course, the men also affected by this. I mean, I'm non-expert, like I said. What is the difference of the effect of the climate change between men, how it affect men and women, and what is the difference, and why you say that women affected the most? Thank you very much, Ms. Jess.
No, that's okay. That's a very big question. So in the simplest form, if you haven't been able to have a look at the presentation, women are disproportionately affected by climate crises simply due to their marginalization and vulnerabilities. So we do not have gender equality anywhere in the world. There are, in every dimension of society, almost every dimension of society, you can find a gender inequity. So there are many reasons why women are disproportionately affected, though. One of them is actually, I look forward to answering Lisa's question, is they are usually responsible for the children and the families. Another is in low socioeconomic countries, which, by the way, are the ones hit most with disasters. Women are predominantly in the agricultural and food industries. So if those industries are destroyed, then it's the women who are affected, their livelihoods, their capacity. Gender-based violence was another really, is another abounding crisis on crisis. So gender-based violence affects women and children more than men, because it happens to women and children more than men. And the connection to climate crisis is that when all these climate crises happen, it opens up those vulnerabilities further. So if you look at displacement and migration, for example, a lot of the refugee camps are not very safe for women. There's some pretty horrifying statistics about assaults and rapes and things that happen in those places, and the displacement and forced migration has been because of climate crisis. Maybe their home has been flooded, maybe drought has forced them to leave the country. And with men, those statistics do apply. Men, experience sexual violence and things like that. It's just at a lower rate. So the women's disadvantage is higher. So the exponential kind of, I guess, damage that happens when climate crises occur makes it worse, if you want to use that term, for men and children than for women. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, if I wasn't misunderstanding, you said that women affected more because of their vulnerability, like that.
Exactly.
Am I
Yes.
correct?
So it's the concept of intersectional disadvantage. So women suffer from more intersectional disadvantage than men do. And that's not the fault of men. It's not men's fault. It doesn't mean men are bad. It's just how our society formulated, right? For a long, long time, all our global leaders were men. For a long, long time, all our academics were men. We can see at Bryn that it's 50-50 women, men, which is great, you know. So it's starting to get very different, but these are, they're called patriarchal norms, very slow to unpack, you know. So right now they do still exist. So there are still very much more vulnerabilities for women and children than there are for men.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can get it. Thank you very much, Miss Jess.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Lely.
Yeah. Probably what we can learn from our case study in Semarang and Demak and Jakarta, perhaps women they doesn't have any equality in terms of access to, for example, if the fisherman is the male, the wife is just the status of the fisherman is man, but the housewife, I mean the wife doesn't have any equal status with the fisherman, like fisherman status. So yeah, she just only membantu suami gitu. So this is like probably another case probably with the decision making, like mostly with the decision making of adaptation, most men are invited to make a decision making, but women sometimes they're not included in this decision making. So probably that's the experience. And Mas Aji or Jess, the pregnant woman, maybe you can answer that.
Sure. I'll just follow on from what you have said, Ibu Laili, and maybe this will help Dina as well. This is gender and climate crises that we're talking about, and I've done it with an assumed knowledge that people know all about gender inequality, right? And you may or may not, but the things that Ibu Laili has mentioned are the biggest I guess, problems in gender inequality, and they're always going to relate to other things, right? If we don't have enough women in leadership positions or we don't have enough women in power, then how are we going to represent and support women's needs in our societies? It's not that simple. I'm oversimplifying it, but the leadership element is one of the huge things that we need to consider, and the decision-making elements. So again, gender mainstreaming in all aspects, by the way, policy-making strategies, but to this particular point, gender mainstreaming and climate crises, will always try to focus on upskilling the women, teaching them leadership skills, because again, not the men's fault, but we're still living, slowly changing, but still living in a world where the governments are run by men, the decisions are made by the men. Lots and lots of really restrictive practices in families and homes can hold women and girls back quite a lot. You know, and we have to obviously take into account religious and cultural beliefs. You know, there are some things that are, you know, ingrained in cultures and societies where women do this and men do that, and women should do this and shouldn't do that, and men should do this and should. So these are all gender issues in general, and then they all apply to climate crises as well. And I'll move now. Lisa, sorry, it's been waiting so long. So that was a very interesting question. Women's health and climate change. Would you say pregnant women are more impacted, and what can be done about this? I would say without a doubt, pregnant women would be more impacted. And I would say that simply because of vulnerability, right? If we think about something really simple, like really simple, a flood has forced a family into migration and the mother is heavily pregnant. How easily do you think it's going to be for this mother to, you know, get herself to a shelter, keep her family safe, keep her child safe? What if she goes into labor in the, you know, wherever she ends up migrating to, and there's no facilities to keep her health safe. So absolutely, that's one of, you know, I don't think anyone would disagree that life in a disaster, if you're pregnant, would be significantly harder than if you were a different kind of person. And what can be done is a big, big question. I'll go back to, that's too big a question for me, but you are 100% right in that health disruptions is one of the biggest things that happens in climate crises. And not that having a child is a health disruption, but it disrupts health care. So I would say what that woman is at risk of. Sorry, just go back to my. You said, are women like that going to be more impacted? Yes, of course, because they may not have access to their healthcare needs, and they may be, you know, climate crises often involves quick escape. You know, maybe they're not able to do that. And what can be done is the only aspect of this that I know very well is the Rohingya crisis, Myanmar, Bangladesh. Is anyone familiar with what's been going on there? Well, basically, there is a refugee camp, and I won't say which, but it's quite a, this isn't my words, this is an assumption, quite a corrupt refugee camp. And what we would need to do in a situation like that is, I would suggest making sure that there are NGOs and unilateral organizations. So that's people that sit above national law, right? So the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, the United Nations, peacekeeping forces. I would say that what can be done about it is that you need an intervention. You need a safety intervention. So if these women are stuck in, you know, unforeseen, difficult to navigate situations, and the support isn't immediately available, then, you know, the rest of humanity needs to come together and help. But that also is the role of the UN. The UN is supposed to monitor refugee camps. Refugee camps are have one of the highest rates of sexual violence acts against women and children, because it's quite lawless. It's a very unique environment, very difficult environment. Yeah. Does that answer your question a little bit, Lisa?
Lisa? Okay. Thank you, Jess. Actually, Jessica is very keen to have like a joint publication with researcher from Research Center for Law. So whoever want to have like a collaboration research joint publication with Jess, like on gender, right? Jess, gender, human rights. Please, you can invite Jess as co-author for the publication. Probably Mas Aji, if you are like interested in like using the theory of intersectionality something, so maybe you can collaborate for book chapter with Jess in the upcoming Springer publication, Mas Aji. So do you probably have a question, or Adis?
There's one I missed from, there's Khalifa has put something in the chat in Bahasa that I don't know, that I can't, and then there's another one from Adis.
Yeah, Adis, can you speak by yourself, Adis, and Padio, and who else? I don't know. Padio, Adis. Yeah, please, Adis. Mana Adis? Adis mana?
While we're waiting for Adis, his question is any international legal frameworks or policies that focus on addressing climate migration from a gender perspective. I think climate mitigation, is that probably the word, Layli? There are many international ones. In fact, all of the United Nations ones should have gender within them. But it's up to you. I'm curious about Indonesia because I haven't found any yet. But what I can do is email you some, because I'm not sure if you're here still on the call. So I can email some of those policies and frameworks to Ibu Layli to pass on. But yes, there are many, and one that I showed you in this presentation was the Montreal Protocol. Is a legal framework, right? It's an international treaty, and it has a very long and very involved history of gender, specifying the Montreal Protocol's legal application with a gender lens applied. Sorry, Ibu Layli, did I miss anyone else?
Yeah, I think that's it from Adis. Probably with the international framework, I'm not really familiar with the gender one, but perhaps there is gender is already mainstreaming in the like the COP UNFCCC, so they also like mainstreaming in this like gender and then climate change. Perhaps Adis, you can look at this conference of the parties from the UNFCCC. So which one is like gender resolution on the UNFCCC on gender and climate change, and perhaps with the Indonesian one, actually we don't have any special legislation, but we are mainstreaming gender into all like the development, like in the Ministry of Women Empowerment. So there's many activities are mainstreaming gender in their ministry. So probably that's one. I'm not really expert on that. Probably someone from Research Center for Law who are expert in the gender, please answer Jessica question about the law in Indonesia on a gender. Mas Haji, do you have any other addition, Mas Haji? Or Maniken? Or Adit? If no more, probably we can finish our.
I have Balele. I have another question, if allowed.
Ibu Layli is the boss.
Oh, yes.
Should we have another?
Yeah. Please, Mbak Dina.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jess, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I am keen to know from you because you're an expert in gender inequality, if I'm not mistaken. I was interested about the last explanation from you and from Mbak Layli about some of the list of women vulnerability. What I say?
Vulnerability.
Yeah.
Vulnerability. Okay. I have language barrier. Okay. Can you tell us more about the list of the vulnerability of the women? What Mbak Layli and you mentioned some of the vulnerability of the women. The last time you just now you said about maybe the pregnancy or the vulnerability about physically or in the position, in social position. Can you tell me more, tell us more, the list of the vulnerability of the women? I want to know. Thank you very much, Jess.
So you keep asking the big questions, Dina. With this is something we can talk about offline. I would be happy to talk to you about the intersectional element, because if it's something that isn't yet at the forefront of your practice, then it needs further explanation than I can do it justice to today. But basically, if you can see this diagram, these are not all, but some of the dimensions of intersectionality. Can you see the diagram, Dina?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So intersectionality is a broad term to include any dimension where a human being could experience disadvantage. So let's say in the middle in the gray here is Donald Trump, right? He has everything, not anymore, thank God, he's been indicted. But, you know, he once was the most powerful person in the planet. He has all the money, he has all the power, he gets to make all the decisions, he has all the wives he wants, he can do whatever he wants. That would be a person in that gray area who sort of has every privilege possible. And then the intersects, race, gender identity, religion, class, sexual orientation, those are the things that can not take power away, but increase vulnerability. So me, if I were to use me as an example, my religion, my low socioeconomic background, surprise, surprise, my parents are refugees too, my gender identity and my ability, by the way, which isn't included in here, but physical ability is included as well. All of those are vulnerabilities. So I think the best thing to keep in mind when you're trying to connect intersectionality to gender is that almost all of them can be expanded in a crisis. And the only thing, how can I make it simpler? It all goes back to a history of man and patriarchy that we're untying ourselves from, you know, that Bryn is untying itself from by giving opportunities to men, women, gender diverse people from different backgrounds. All of that is intersectional, by the way. So it all comes back down to we want an even distribution of power amongst people to achieve gender equality. But at the moment, women are vulnerable in all of those intersections, more vulnerable than men. So remember how economy or social class was one of them? Sometimes, more often than not, again, even in rich democratic Western nations like the US, a woman is disadvantaged to her male partner because the male partner can get a top job at the law firm and she cannot, because gender discrimination exists. Maybe, you know, it's not always the case. And it's hard for me to talk to people about this a lot of the time because it comes out as man-hating. You know, gender equality is not man-hating. Gender equality is simply recognizing that because of the way that history has progressed, we've had men in leadership positions and power for a long time. It's just how our society was built. And we're just trying to bring the women up there. We're not trying to bring the men down at all. We're just trying to close the gap. So if a woman has any intersectional vulnerability, it's going to be harder for her to close that gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can. I get it, Miss Jess. Yes, I understand.
I think if Ibuleli is okay with sharing my email with everyone once I get my Brin email, we can absolutely. I'm so happy to talk to you more about it.
Yes. Hopefully soon. So is there any more question? Pak Taufik, Pak Mbak Meti, nggak ada. Mas Haji kemana ya? Okay, so I think that's all for our guest lecture today. Hopefully, just we can work with you in the next 6 months. Thank you for today lecture and discussion. It is very helpful and give us insight on how is the linkage between gender and climate change. And thank you for all active participation from from our research center for law, Pusat Riset Hukum. So it's mostly from the young researcher, yes. So like Dina is a young researcher. She's like writing on corruption, ya. Apa?
Great.
Yes,
Corruption.
about the corruption, and interesting to I have an idea now to write about the women suspected
Great.
how it is affect. How
Okay,
about
maybe. Yeah, maybe you can write with Jess, and then
I'm so pleased to have an effect. Thank you very much.
yeah. So thank you for all, and then see you again in the next round of guest lecture. So I close this guest lecture and thank you.
Terima
Thank you,
kasih. Thank
Terima
you so much,
kasih.
everybody. It is my pleasure to
Have a
Thank you very much, Ibu
day for
Laili.
everyone. Yeah, thank you, Jess.
Terima kasih, Mbak Leli.